Hi everyone, Samy from Ketchapp, back again for this fifth edition of the Hypergames conferences. Happy to be here. Before we start, I want to have a quick word for the HGC team who organized this event in these troubled times. Obviously, we're behind you and we'll continue to do everything we can to support all our partners who are impacted by the current situation. Now, I'm here to talk about hypercasual, so let's jump into today's topic, our players' sense of rationality. Or should I say, lack of rationality? Because our players, as much as any human being, are deep down lazy persons with limited attention. And the thing is, we live in a world saturated of information signals. The ones we were exposed to, the ones that we look for, the ones that we receive from friends. With each of these situations comes a micro choice to check or not, and to react or to ignore. And this is where our players' laziness enters the scene. Because there are so many choices, because our attention is constantly solicited, our brain will take shortcuts to take the best decision in a limited amount of time using a minimum amount of energy. And in this attempt of simplification, we might commit a thinking error. This is a cognitive bias. Now you may wonder, what's there for you? Well, these biases can be used to nudge your players and influence their actions. And because hyper-casual games are by nature entirely relying on the attention they get from the players, cognitive biases are already heavily exploited across the industry. Whether it's at the user acquisition stage to generate more marketable ideas with more effective creatives, or later on to influence the player's in-game behavior. In today's presentation, we'll break down some of the most effective biases used in our industry to better understand the deep reasons and roots behind our players' actions. The goal is to give you the key to ideate in the right direction at the feature level, to innovate and create effective new features that will make your game more engaging in the end. And we'll start this presentation with some of the most impactful biases exploited in user acquisition campaigns. Now, because we need to target the widest possible audience, the marketability of our game is crucial. And as you know, the marketability of your game depends as much, if not more, on its ID than on its creatives. So we'll actually address both in this first part. Second disclaimer, just because I present you a certain bias in the UA category doesn't mean that it can't be applied to your in-game or monetization strategy. The idea is just to expose you the current main use of each bias in the market. Now, without further ado, I want to start with two very interesting biases that are very closely linked and complementary. Together, they explain one of the key defining aspects of the hyper-casual market, its trend-based DNA. Now, let me develop that further. The first of these two biases is called the mere exposure one. In short, it says that we tend to prefer things we are familiar with. This is actually the cognitive concept behind what we usually call the relatability in hyper-casual. If your player can relate with your game, they are way more likely to be interested in it. More concretely, if a UA video includes references which find echoes in your player's mind, the game's way more likely to get lower acquisition costs. We actually ran a quite interesting experiment not so long ago on many games we tested over the last year. More than 90% of the most promising CPIs we got back then came from the most relatable concepts we tested. By most relatable, I mean that they were either depicting daily life situations or surfing on trendy TikTok videos, pop culture references, or telling universally understandable short stories like a chase between cops and thieves, for example. So, systematically integrating one of these can be something to keep in mind in order to ideate in the right direction and thus get performing creatives. Now, this bias can actually be amplified by the bandwagon effect, also called herd mentality. Basically, we are more likely to adopt a certain behavior if we see others doing so. The thing is that in our globalized world, and especially in Western countries, we consume and watch people consume a big chunk of the entertainment content on a very limited number of big platforms: YouTube, Netflix, TikTok, to only mention a few ones. This means that more than ever before in the history of humanity, hundreds of millions of humans can share the same interests and references almost simultaneously. In short, thanks to the digital word of mouth and to our needs of social conformity, trends can potentially benefit from a stronger than ever snowballing effect that we can then leverage to reach huge audiences. So, these two biases explain why many publishers and developers desperately try to surf on social trends, and why we've seen so many Squid Games or Puppy Playtime inspired games over the last month. But creating relatable and trendy games is just a start. And focusing on these two biases only would be dangerous, as they both tend to a certain uniformization of the market. Which brings us to our second batch of cognitive biases. In a context where players are exposed to thousands of different products and information each day, standing out to get their attention is hard. And it becomes even harder if all these products are based on similar global trends. That's why you should make sure to leverage and combine these two key biases. First, the isolation effect, which states that when confronted to numerous similar signals, you're more likely to remember the one that differs the most from the rest. And second, the bizarreness effect, which basically means that we better remember the weirdest things. These two effects are actually behind two notions that we have theorized in hypercasual a long time ago: the need of freshness and to generate a wow effect with your game. And to create this wow effect, targeting emotions proved to be a powerful approach. Remember that the best way to get your user's attention is to target his feelings. The worst thing that could happen in the attention economy would be to have a user who would remain neutral regarding the content you produce. Now, the question remains open. What kind of emotions and feeling should we leverage? You can target positive feelings like satisfaction, especially with ASMR games, for example, humor, curiosity, but I'm not gonna lie, the market definitely has its preference. And the easy win to grab attention is obviously the exploitation of the dark side of humanity, as our darkest pulsions seem to generate a strong fascination power. You can decide to disgust, shock, frustrate, unease. Basically, if you lack inspiration, anything related to the seven capital sins will work to generate negative emotions. Now, let me present you a few examples to illustrate that. The shockingly gore um, connection and its weirdly satisfying bloody explosions. Fat to Fit remains a very good example of how provocative an HC game can be. It was actually kicked out of the App Store for that. And finally, one of the best creatives of Merge Animals 3D from Estoti relies on a quite disturbing, let's say, human body morphing. On that topic, you want to remain careful to not overdo it. Because when you play with negative emotions, you are very quickly walking on a thin line regarding app stores and advertising platforms. So you want to be careful about that. Finally, one of the main bias that is heavily leveraged in UA is the illusory superiority. This one is quite straightforward. We all tend to share one common point. We consider ourselves smarter than the average. Or, to rephrase, as a French stand-upper used to say, no matter how intelligent we are, we always feel we are intelligent enough since we judge with our own intelligence. One very effective way to trigger this bias is to showcase UA creatives where the player fails miserably to solve extremely simple problems. In addition to that, you just need to add a slightly taunting tagline like the famous 99% of the players can't solve that problem, and you'll have the perfect cocktail, like in this Origame video. On one side, you'll flatter your user's ego by showing him that indeed he is smarter than the average, and on the other side, you'll frustrate him by showcasing a highly unsatisfying action. Downloading the game is in this situation the quick and easy way to erase the unsatisfaction and to prove that you're indeed smarter than people around you. Now, let's talk about the in-game. And we'll start with the peak-end effect and its impact on retention. To put it simply, it states that since we have a limited memory, we tend to recap and evaluate an experience on its key moments, meaning the most intense ones and its ending. In theory, insisting on making these two elements super satisfying should be critical to make the player come back after one session. The most obvious illustration of this bias lies in the evolution of the runner genre and its minigame ending. These minigames progressively went from nice bonuses to the main defining moments of a runner experience. Battery Run 3D from Voodoo is a very good example on that side. The runner part of its levels is quite classic, but the main show starts after you reach the finish line. As you can see, all the satisfaction actually comes from the diversity and the juiciness of the multiple end of level mechanics that they implemented in the game. So quite interesting to see that evolution. But the peak doesn't necessarily have to happen at the end of the level. We could even argue that it would be even better to have multiple peaks in one level to generate a more constant satisfaction. And the example of Invincible Hero is quite interesting on that matter. Here, the peak is the ultimate power of our character that you unlock after a few combos. Thanks to the progression bar that you see, you come to look forward to the peak, and it really gives you a constant short-term objective that makes this feature quite interesting playtime-wise. And finally, you can push the peak frequency even further, like in Flippy Race, where literally each jump can be a peak opportunity. The result is a core gameplay that will feel extremely nervous and constantly satisfying. With Flippy Race, in Flippy Race's case, just so you know, we have 4 years after the game's launch, the 14 retention of more than 15% in average. So quite impressive, and you might want to leverage that effect. Then comes a very interesting and sometimes borderline feature, the placebo effect. Basically, if you're convinced that a feature has a specific effect, your brain will trick you to think that, well, it does, even if that effect is in fact very limited or doesn't exist. For a very long time, the primary use of this bias has been to trick the players with fake multiplayers, in Dota.io games especially. The goal was to make them think that they were playing against other real players when they were actually, in fact, fighting against bots. But nowadays, the most interesting feature leveraging this technique is probably the placebo stats, as HC games tend to become deeper, their meta features are becoming more important, and in that content, the stats upgrades are more used than ever for the progression feeling they can bring. But the thing is, this can become tricky to balance as we need to, well, still launch the game as quickly as possible. So to save time, a common trick is to use placebo stats, an upgrade system where the gameplay impact is very limited or worse, non-existing. These three games, in their own way, are leveraging the placebo effect. But be careful. For this feature to be efficient on the long run, you need to implement it in a smart way. Because if the impact of your upgrade is completely fake, well, the players will discover it sooner or later, and they will very quickly stop investing time or energy in that feature. Two very interesting techniques to leverage the placebo effect can be first the use of the logarithmic progression for your stats, meaning that the first upgrades have a strong visible impact, and the more you upgrade, the less the effect is impactful until it becomes almost non-existent. And a second way to do it, like Estoti and Mempic did in Drive Hills, is to actually associate visual progression to each upgrade so that each time you upgrade your vehicle, even if it doesn't have a gameplay impact, you can see your vehicle become shinier and more impressive, more good looking with, I don't know, bigger wheels, shinier design, additional accessories. Now, we've seen that by leveraging the placebo and the piquant effect, you could increase your players' engagement. And what's really cool is that the more engaged they are, the better our next bias can be leveraged. I want to talk here about the sunk cost fallacy. Basically, it states that it's really hard to let go something you've invested time and effort in. Applied to your game, it means that the more your player will progress in your game, the more they will feel that they are building something in it, the more likely they are to play further. So you really want to insist on all the features that could remind to the players what they've really already achieved in the game. It can be done with a world map showcasing the past progression of the players, like we did in crowd defense. Side note, it's a different topic, but these world maps can also be used to tease future content, so they can have a double positive impact on your game's KPIs. Then you can insist on the collection aspect of your game by showcasing everything the players have already achieved in galleries like in Heroes Inc., for example. Just note that here, the collectionist approach is usually only interesting for your most engaged players. So it's not a solution that will make your game perform better with all your players, but can be interesting to still leverage it. And finally, the sense of progression can be diegetic, like and to exist in the world of your character, like in arcade idol titles, where your character actually evolves in the world that you're building. My Little Universe is obviously a great example on that side, as you're literally building your own planets. And this bias is actually very close from another one that is heavily used to push monetization opportunities. I'm talking about the effort justification bias, also called the IKEA effect. It explains that the things we contribute to build have more value in our eyes than the same thing if they were given to us, basically. So, just like your IKEA furnitures, you like them more than they deserve because you put some efforts in creating them. It notably explains the success of one of the most used rewarded video placements in hyper casual, which is the Fillbox. You know that RV that's where after each level you unlock a small percentage of your final gift, which very often is a skin. Since it takes you time and efforts to unlock the skin this way, it seems more valuable than if it was just given to you in a surprise gift, for example. This explains how your efforts influence the value you perceive from things. But another important factor that can influence the perceived value of an object is the usage experience we accumulate with it. People are indeed giving more value to an object that they have already owned than to the same object when they do not own it. That's the endowment effect. And it notably explains the success of trials offers. Because when we get used to owning an object, whether it's a cosmetic or a gameplay boost, we are finding it more valuable than if it was just presented to us in a shop, for example. And we are thus more likely to purchase it at a potentially higher price later on. This is, for example, the case in Flippy Race, where after a trial offer, where you can try a super fast jet ski, you will be able to keep it against a certain amount of hard currency. And the screenshot you see here could have potentially been more efficient if we had decided to take more advantage of our next bias. This one is quite easily understandable. Nobody likes to miss opportunities. The reasoning behind this bias is that the pain of a loss usually feels more painful than the pleasure of an equivalent gain. And if you're familiar with the concept of fear of missing out, FOMO, well, this is exactly it. Now, to leverage this effect in game, two main techniques are usually used. The guiltifying messages, typically the lose it message that you will find below a RV button, like in this screenshot from Just Survive. You're not actually losing something here because you don't have this skin yet. But with just a few simple words, it just feels like it. Just feels like you're losing something that you own. Now, there are ways to make the opportunity loss feel even more painful by targeting directly the player's feelings. This is what Trade Island did very well in game. You'll have the opportunity at some point to save this cute little kitty, and as you can see, the choice is quite harsh because you can either adopt the cat or let it die. And I mean, who would be cruel enough to do that? So that was the first technique, the guiltifying UI. And the second is actually relying on time limited opportunities. Although we need to remain very careful with time pressure in hyper casual, when added to power up systems, it can significantly boost their attractivity. This is what we saw actually in our game Crowd Defense, where the in-level power-ups appear on screen at a critical moment when you need it. For example, you have this huge crowd walking in your direction, and you can decide to slow them down to give you more time, or to watch an RV to get more ammunition, or to call for an airstrike. But these pop-up buttons are only here for a few seconds. So if you don't tap on it, who knows when or if you'll ever get this opportunity again. And finally, our last bias of the day, the price value effect. We are conditioned to think that more expensive means more valuable and thus more desirable. And this perceived value can be leveraged to push smarter RV opportunities. For example, in Invincible Heroes, you clearly understand while scrolling across the shop that some skins are way more valuable than the others. And the price of 7 RVs to unlock one skin that might have looked way too expensive otherwise suddenly seems to be more justified. And we feel that way also because the clarity of this effect is reinforced because of how the shop is designed with the now universal reward tiers, common, rare, epic, and legendary. And with Stealth Master, we have one of the best examples of situations where you can take advantage of this bias. As you can see, at some points during the level, you're able to choose between three weapons. The less rare, on the left, is the only one that you can get without watching a RV. But this is also the less sexy one. As the color, code, and their price indicate, the shotgun and the crossbow should indeed be way more valuable. And obviously, they are locked behind RVs. So in the end, this is, as you can see, a very smart way to orient, to nudge your players, to make them watch additional RVs. As a conclusion, I would like to take a step back on what we saw today. First, cognitive biases are already heavily exploited in hypercasual. They are used at each step of the process of creating a game, from the ideation to the UA, and for the in-game features, whether it's to improve retention or monetization. Obviously, many of the features we saw today are already best practices from the industry that you might already knew about. But my point was to make sure you understand why they work that well on our players. Because the end game on a market where innovation is the key isn't to just reproduce features that prove to be working. It's also, and actually mostly, about innovating and proposing new features that will become the best practices of tomorrow. And to do so, it's critical to understand the roots of a player's reasoning, to build on it, and to become as ambitious at finding new performing features than we are at finding new performing game ideas. Now, just like with game ideas, you can use the merging concepts method to come up with new tricks. For example, by mixing the loss aversion and the placebo effect, like in Merge Animal, you can get that quite misleading RV feature. The user is actually tricked to think that he needs to watch an RV to unlock the next bonus, when watching the RV is actually not even necessary. As you'll see in that video, you unlock the bonus anyway. Even if you decide to say no, as we do here, you benefit from the bonus. You could also combine the loss aversion and the price value effect, like in Save the Town from Studio Rouleau. At this stage, you need to choose to save only one of the survivors, meaning that the other one will die killed by the monsters that are chasing you. The dilemma is here reinforced by the price value effect and the UI that clearly shows that Sarah would be a more valuable choice. And to finish with a quite interesting combo, we have this example, which is leveraging the mere exposure bias and the bandwagon and bizarreness effects. You will here recognize the universally known Kanye West following the ASMR trend of frozen oni with a weird twist, as you can see. And that's on that video that reminds us that we work in a uniquely creative industry that I'll conclude this presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed this presentation and that it will inspire you for your future games. Today is a national holiday in France, so this video was pre-recorded, but don't hesitate to reach out to me on LinkedIn if you have any question or want to discuss anything related to your studio situation. Stay safe and see you soon. Bye.